Against the backdrop of such legendary aircraft as the Messerschmitt fighter or the Junkers dive bomber, the Henschel 126 reconnaissance and artillery spotter somehow faded into obscurity. Yet this aircraft was very widespread in the German Air Force and made a significant contribution to all military campaigns at the beginning of the Second World War. This machine became one of the first aviation developments of the Henschel Company, which had previously specialized in building steam locomotives. Work on it began back in 1933, when a technical specification was issued for the design of a new short-range reconnaissance aircraft intended to replace the outdated Henschel biplane. Special attention was paid to takeoff and landing characteristics, as well as to the aircraft's behavior at low speeds. A design team under the direction of engineer Nikolaus chose the layout of a single-engine high-wing monoplane with a simple, fixed landing gear. This configuration was very popular at the time for aircraft of such purpose. For example, the French Murau or the Polish Lublin. The all-metal construction gave the reconnaissance aircraft high strength while keeping the takeoff weight moderate. The aircraft received the designation Henschel 122. The designers developed several variants for different engines. The first prototype was built in 1935 with a British liquid-cooled inline Kestrel engine rated at 535 horsepower, followed by a second version with a German Siemens radial engine of 660 horsepower. The second proved more successful, and soon, based on this project, a third prototype was manufactured. In the summer and autumn of 1935, it underwent official testing at Fassberg. However, it turned out that the advantage of the new monoplane over the modernized Henschel, which had just entered production, was very small. The aircraft clearly lacked power. For further trials, a small batch of 7 aircraft was prepared. They were delivered to the Military Acceptance Commission in the spring and summer of 1936. Meanwhile, an improved version appeared, which differed so much from its predecessor that it received a new designation, Henschel 126. The wing shape was altered. It became more angular in plan form, and its area was reduced without changing the span. The nose section of the fuselage was lengthened and the vertical tail was redesigned. The pyramidal landing gear struts of the previous model were replaced with cantilever ones. The cockpit was designed as semi-enclosed. The gunner's position was covered by a canopy only in the front. The new reconnaissance aircraft was planned to be equipped with a 9-cylinder Brahmo Fafnir radial engine. The fourth aircraft of the previous series was converted into the experimental Henschel 126. It was ready in the autumn of 1936. Since the Fafnir engine did not arrive on time, the aircraft was fitted with a Jumo inline engine. The cockpit remained open for the time being. In the spring of 1937, the second and third prototypes appeared, now with Brahmo engines of 830 horsepower and 3-bladed propellers. The second prototype was distinguished by the installation of a turbocharger. It is hard to say why it was mounted on an aircraft intended from the outset for low altitudes, an enlarged rudder, and a modified system of struts. On the third prototype, the vertical tail was redesigned once more in an attempt to achieve the optimal balance between directional stability and controllability. On the first 2 prototypes, the landing gear struts were slightly raked backward. On the ground, they were perpendicular to the surface, while on the third, they were mounted at a right angle to the fuselage axis. The trials continued until the end of the summer of 1937. This time, the machine turned out to be entirely successful. The reconnaissance aircraft demonstrated good controllability and maneuverability, was stable on all axes, and could operate from small airfields. Its construction was strong and, importantly, well suited for mass production, with a large number of stamped and pressed parts. The equipment and armament of the Henschel 126 fully met the required standards. Even during testing, the company began producing a pre-series batch of 10 aircraft. They were completed by the end of 1937. At the beginning of the following year, serial production of the Henschel 126 was established simultaneously at 2 plants, in Schönefeld and Johannisthal. Due to a shortage of Brahmo engines, they were fitted with 9-cylinder BMW radial engines with direct fuel injection, developing a rated power of 880 horsepower. This drove a 3-bladed variable pitch metal propeller. The Henschel 126 represented, for its time, a highly advanced universal aircraft for cooperation with ground forces. It could be used as a tactical day and night reconnaissance aircraft, an artillery fire spotter, a light attack aircraft, and a liaison plane. Aircraft of this type were widely used in the air forces of many countries. In concept, the Henschel was very close to the British Lysander and the Polish Mewa. As already mentioned, the Henschel 126 was a single-engine aircraft with a wing mounted above the fuselage. The structure was predominantly metal, with only the rudders and ailerons covered in fabric. The fuselage had a semi-monocoque design with pressed frames and stringers. In the nose section, the engine was mounted on a tubular frame, enclosed by a tightly fitting cowling with special stampings for the cylinder heads. The flow of cooling air was regulated by a cowl flap skirt with hydraulic drive. Behind the engine, between the frame struts, were the oil tank and oil cooler. Behind the firewall, on the right side, was installed a fixed 7.9mm machine gun with an ammunition box for 500 rounds. The crew cockpit was located in the central part of the fuselage. The pilot and the observer gunner sat in tandem. The pilot was protected in front, above, and to the sides by a transparent canopy, which slid backward for entry. The gunner's position was completely open, with only folding wind deflectors on the canopy shielding him from the airflow during firing. The pilot's instrument set was quite modest, but it was entirely sufficient for carrying out assigned tasks. Beneath his feet was the fuel tank. The gunner sat on a folding seat slightly lower than the pilot. For defense, he had a 7.9mm machine gun on a swivel mount manufactured by Arado. In the stowed position, the machine gun was swung over to the right side, where there was a special recess for the barrel. The ammunition supply consisted of 13 magazines containing a total of 975 rounds. The gunner also operated a semi-automatic Zeiss vertical camera, which photographed through a hatch in the fuselage bottom covered by a retractable shutter. For oblique photography, there was also a handheld camera mounted in a socket on the left side of the cockpit. The colored lines on the fuselage sides, often clearly visible in photographs, indicated different angles for shooting with this camera. Behind the gunner's position was a small bomb bay. The Henschel 126 had a conventional tail unit with a fin built integrally with the fuselage. The horizontal tailplane was raised to about mid-fin height and braced to the fuselage with V-shaped tubular struts. The elevators and rudder were fitted with trim tabs. The landing gear consisted of two main cantilever struts, with oleo-pneumatic shock absorbers and a steerable tailwheel. At the front, the wheel fairings were usually removed because at field airstrips they were often clogged with grass and dirt, creating a risk of the aircraft overturning. The wing was connected to the fuselage by N-shaped struts and V-shaped braces, to which were attached small subsidiary struts about mid-span. The wing had the form of a peculiar pedal with a straight leading edge and pronounced sweepback. Above the cockpit, a large cutout was made to improve upward visibility. The basis of the wing structure consisted of two I-beam spars and a fairly dense set of truss ribs. The wing was built in two halves with a joint along the aircraft's center line. The entire wing, except for the ailerons, had metal skinning. The aileron framework was metal, but they were fabric covered. Takeoff and landing performance was improved by flaps operated by a hydraulic drive. For direct troop support, the Henschel 126 could employ its defensive and bomb armament, 2 machine guns and 10 10-kilogram bombs, about 22 pounds in the bomb bay, 2 racks of 5 bombs. In overload condition, one 50-kilogram bomb, about 110 pounds, could be carried on a removable bomb rack mounted on the left side near the strut attachment point. For intimidating the enemy, the Henschel was sometimes fitted with a siren driven by a small wind turbine. It was mounted on a short pylon under the fuselage. The Henschel 126's equipment included a radio set, its antenna stretched between a mast on the wing along the aircraft's axis and a small post on the rudder. The radio was located between the pilot and observer on the left side. It could also work with an auxiliary trailing antenna extended through a special tube. The aircraft carried a full set of navigation lights and 2 landing lamps, one in each wing. In the spring of 1938, these aircraft began entering Luftwaffe short-range reconnaissance squadrons, replacing older biplanes. By September 19th, 42 aircraft of various modifications, 35 of them operational, were already in frontline units. That same year, they underwent their combat debut. In the autumn of 1938, 6 aircraft were sent to Spain to replace older machines in a reconnaissance flight of the Condor Legion. They took part in the final phase of the Civil War, operating as reconnaissance planes and light bombers. The 5 aircraft that survived the war were later transferred to Franco's forces. For several years, they served in the 41st Independent Flight in Morocco. At the beginning of 1939, Greece ordered 16 aircraft. The Germans, who needed foreign currency, promptly fulfilled the order. The aircraft were delivered to the 3rd Army Cooperation Squadron of the Hellenic Air Force. These machines were later used as light attack aircraft against the Italian army that invaded the country. On November 21, 1940, 3 Henschel 126s managed with bombs and machine gun fire to rout a column of Italian troops near Pogradec. The German invasion was apparently not survived by the Greek Henschels. But let us go back a little in time. At the outbreak of World War II, the German Air Force had 275 Henschel aircraft in service. These machines had almost completely displaced older biplane models from combat units. Only 6 of the 29 Luftwaffe short-range reconnaissance squadrons still flew the obsolete types, and another 7 squadrons retained a few of them in service. To the first version of the aircraft were added new models with improved 850 horsepower engines with 2-speed superchargers. These engines, in combination with new propellers, enhanced both takeoff and altitude performance. Later, boosted engines rated at 900 horsepower were installed. Externally, the new engines were distinguished by a redesigned exhaust system. Instead of paired outlets along the fuselage sides, there appeared slot exhausts with a special controllable scoop. All aircraft of the new series were fitted with new shortwave radios. For the attack on Poland, the Germans concentrated a total of 13 squadrons of Henschels. Facing weak resistance from Polish fighters and anti-aircraft artillery, these aircraft successfully carried out tactical reconnaissance ahead of tank columns, directed artillery fire, and directly supported ground troops on the battlefield. German losses were small. In May 1940, 10 squadrons of short-range reconnaissance aircraft took part in the French campaign. In total, on May 11th, there were 277 Henschels in service. In particular, they carried out photo reconnaissance before the breakthrough of the Maginot Line. Here, the situation became more difficult for these aircraft. The quality of the French and especially British fighters could not be compared with what the Poles had. Losses began to rise already at the start of 1940. The aircraft's speed did not allow it to escape from fighters, and its weak armament prevented it from defending itself. The concept of a slow reconnaissance observer had outlived its time. The production of the Henschel was already being gradually wound down, and from April 1940 it was decided to begin production of the much more modern twin-engine reconnaissance Focke-Wulf, widely known in the Soviet Union as the frame. From the beginning of the war until the end of 1939, 137 aircraft of the new modification were built. However, the introduction of the Focke-Wulf was somewhat delayed, and during 1940 another 368 aircraft were produced. In 1940, the reconnaissance and artillery spotting Henschel also became known in the Soviet Union. This happened after the Red Army entered the Baltic states. In fact, this machine had previously been shown in Germany to various Soviet aviation delegations, both in the field and at factories. But it aroused no special interest and was not among the aircraft purchased for detailed study. One Henschel was discovered in Lithuania. This aircraft had made a forced landing during the Polish campaign and was interned by the Lithuanians. The Lithuanian military examined the machine but did not use it in their air force. It simply remained in a hangar. A richer catch was obtained in Estonia. From the former Estonian Air Force, Soviet aviation received several serviceable Henschels of the new modification, purchased shortly before in Germany. They were used to form a squadron attached to the 22nd Territorial Rifle Corps of the Red Army, created from the remnants of the Estonian Army. Alongside several British Hart biplanes and a single twin-engine Anson, the squadron received 5 Henschels. Unfortunately, only the personnel logbook of the squadron survived in the archives, so it was not possible to trace the further fate of the Soviet Henschels. In January, factories produced 5 aircraft of the new modification, but there were still quite a few in service with the German Air Force. In the spring of 1941, they fought in Greece and Yugoslavia. From June, their main theater of operations became the Soviet Union. All short-range reconnaissance squadrons concentrated near the Soviet border before the war were equipped exclusively with Henschels. Such squadrons attached to Army Corps and tank divisions played a considerable role in ensuring effective command of German troops in the difficult conditions of the summer of 1941. But the best days of the Henschel were already over. Many fell on Soviet soil, shot down by anti-aircraft fire and destroyed by fighters. Apparently, the first victory was scored by Sergeant Anatoly Konstantinovich Ryazanov on the southwestern front. On his fighter, he shot down a Henschel on June 22nd in broad daylight. Soon after him, the Northern Fleet, ace Boris Fedorovich Safonov, destroyed another such aircraft. On June 24th, he finished off a Henschel damaged by Petr Pavlovich Gubanov. The pilot of the German reconnaissance aircraft, having joined a group of 5 bombers, tried to locate their landing site but never reached his target. Soviet pilots respectfully noted the aircraft's decent maneuverability and high survivability, calling it Kostil, crutch, in the USSR. However, under conditions of active opposition from Soviet aviation, a lone Henschel that came into the sights of Soviet fighters was usually destroyed. The Germans began to tightly cover their short-range reconnaissance aircraft with pairs or even 4s of fighters, but even this did not always help. For example, on September 3, 1941, pilots of the Northern Fleet Air Force intercepted and destroyed a crutch, flying under the escort of 2 Messerschmitts. And in August 1942, there was an incident when British Hurricane fighters near Kastenga shot down both the Henschel and all 3 of its escorting Messerschmitts. The losses were so great that the Germans were forced to seriously reduce the authorized strength of their short-range reconnaissance units. And in November 1941, the first Focke-Wulfs appeared on the Eastern Front. They were received by the 31st Reconnaissance Group. The Henschels were reassigned to the role of night reconnaissance aircraft. At that time, the Soviet Air Force had almost no specialized night fighters, and here the slowness and weak armament of the Henschels were not an obstacle. Apart from the Eastern Front, Henschel Hs 126 aircraft were also used in North Africa. There, only 1 squadron of German reconnaissance aviation was based. From mid-1942, these aircraft were gradually withdrawn from the front line and transferred to flight schools and liaison units. But already in the autumn of that same year, a new use was found for them. Henschel Hs 126 aircraft began to equip night bomber squadrons, which the Germans created following the example of Soviet nightlight bomber regiments. There, as in the USSR at the beginning of the war, they gathered training aircraft and outdated multi-purpose machines of various models. The number of such squadrons constantly grew. In the spring of 1943, they were consolidated into larger groups corresponding to regiments. These aircraft were also used in the rear against partisans in Belarus and Yugoslavia. In Belarus, for example, they were used by the so-called Operational Group, which had at its disposal a wide variety of outdated aircraft, including even transport machines built in 1926. The Henschel Hs 126 was often converted for towing assault gliders. The towing device had the form of a pyramidal structure made of tubes attached to the rear fuselage behind the tailwheel. Such aircraft were employed, for example, to supply forward German units on the Don in January 1943. The last Henschel Hs 126 aircraft, which served as night reconnaissance planes, survived until the end of the war. In particular, in April 1945, several of these aircraft still remained in a squadron operating in Austria. Henschel Hs 126 went down in history as an example of a well-designed aircraft, created by talented engineers, but within the framework of a mistakenly chosen overall concept. This is what determined its relatively short service life on the front line. The Henschel Hs 126 was a single-engine high-wing monoplane made of metal. The fuselage had a semi-monocoque construction with a load-bearing frame produced by pressing. The skin was made of duralumin, with the exception of the rudder, which was fabric-covered. In the nose section of the fuselage, the engine was mounted on a tubular frame. The engine cowling fit tightly against the fuselage with curved bulges over the cylinder heads. At the bottom of the cowling were adjustable louvers operated by a hydraulic drive. Behind the engine, in front of the crew cockpit, were located the oil tank and oil cooler. The main fuel tank of the aircraft was positioned in the lower fuselage, practically beneath the pilot's feet. On the right side, behind the firewall, a single, fixed, synchronized machine gun of 0.31-inch caliber was installed, with an ammunition supply of 500 rounds. The pilot and the observer, who also served as gunner, radio operator, and photographer, sat one behind the other in a shared cockpit, located in the central section of the fuselage. The cockpit was semi-enclosed. The pilot's station was fully covered with glass, and the canopy slid backward for entry and exit. The observer's position was almost entirely open. When firing from the rear machine gun, the gunner was only partially shielded from the airstream by folding deflector screens and a small upward opening cover. The latter proved inconvenient in use and was usually removed in combat units. For defense of the rear hemisphere, the reconnaissance aircraft carried one 0.31-inch machine gun, movably mounted at the rear edge of the cockpit on a swiveling mount. Its ammunition consisted of 13 detachable magazines with a total of 975 rounds. In the stowed position, the weapon folded to the right side and was fixed in a special channel. The gunner at that time sat on a folding seat slightly lower than the pilot. The observer also operated an automatic vertical camera. Photography was carried out through a hatch in the fuselage floor, closed by a sliding shutter. In addition, the reconnaissance equipment included one handheld oblique camera, mounted in a socket on the left side of the cockpit. Diagonal colored lines running along the fuselage from the operator's station toward the nose of the aircraft, usually clearly visible in photos, served for correctly determining shooting angles when using this camera. Behind the gunner's seat was a small bomb bay. Its standard equipment consisted of 2 bomb racks, each holding 5 fragmentation bombs weighing 22 pounds. For use of the aircraft as a light bomber, the vertical camera had to be removed. In an overloaded configuration, provision was also made for suspension of a single bomb weighing up to 110 pounds on a detachable rack mounted on the left side at the wing root. However, this variant was rarely employed. The asymmetric load made control difficult, and only highly experienced crews could fly with a side bomb. Occasionally, when the aircraft was used as a ground attack machine to intimidate the enemy, a siren driven by the airflow was mounted under the fuselage on a small pylon. The Henschel Hs 126 was obligatorily equipped with a radio set, with an antenna stretched from a tall mast on the wing, mounted along the central fuselage axis, to a small post on top of the vertical tail. The radio itself was installed in the crew cockpit on the left side between the pilot's and gunner's seats. In case of damage or breakage of the main antenna, a reserve retractable trailing antenna with a weight could be deployed through a special tube in the lower fuselage. Later models were equipped with an ultra-shortwave radio set. The tail unit followed the classical layout, with the fin built as an integral part of the fuselage. The stabilizer was positioned roughly halfway up the fin. The rigidity of the horizontal tail attachment to the fuselage was reinforced by vertical tubular struts. The rudder and elevators were fitted with horn balances and trim tabs. Their frames were metal and the covering was fabric. The wing of the Hs 126 had an unusual shape, resembling a flower petal. It was almost straight at the leading edge with a slight curve, while the trailing edge had several angles, and the wingtips were rounded to an oval shape. The wing had no dihedral. Above the cockpit, a large angular cutout at 45 degrees to the aircraft axis allowed the crew to see better above. The wing structure was based on 2 strong spars and a framework of closely spaced ribs. It was assembled from 2 halves joined at the fuselage centerline, with the leading edge noticeably swept back. The entire wing skin was metal except for the ailerons, the movable parts on the trailing edge controlling roll. These, like the rudder and elevators, were fabric covered. In addition to ailerons, the wing was fitted with hydraulically operated flaps to improve takeoff and landing performance. The wing was attached to the fuselage by 2 N-shaped struts and a pair of strong V-shaped braces, inclined supports running from the fuselage to the wing. About midway along the wing, additional small N-shaped braces were attached to these supports. For night flying, the wing was fitted with 2 landing lights, one on each side, as well as a full set of navigation lights. The landing gear was of the tailwheel type with 2 main struts at the front and 1 support at the rear. The main struts were independent units with pneumatic oil shock absorbers that absorbed landing impacts. The tail support had a small air-filled wheel that could swivel in different directions. All wheels, including the tail one, were covered with fairings, special housings that reduced air resistance. However, at the front, these housings were often removed since grass and dirt would clog them, which could cause the aircraft to tip forward while moving on the ground. The tailwheel fairing was removed from production altogether and replaced with a small half fender, similar to a bicycle mudguard. It protected the lower part of the rudder from dirt and splashes.